Welcome back. Let's now start to really learn the JavaScript language, starting with values and variables. And let's start by getting rid of some of the code that we have here. So this one here isn't doing anything. And let's also delete this one so that we don't get that annoying pop-up all the time. So in this section, I will be using persons as examples. For example, a person's name, a person's age, or a job. All right. But anyway, let's talk about values now. So a value is basically a piece of data. So it's the most fundamental unit of information that we have in programming. For example, this text, Jonas, is a value. All right. So this here is a value. And again, if we want to actually see this in the console, let's say console.log, and then open up the parentheses, and then close them here, and then the semicolons. So if I save and reload, then of course we get Jonas. Okay, and so Jonas here is the value. Or we can of course have different values. For example here, 23 is the value. Right? And so now we see 23 in the console. And the same is true up here. So in this line of code, where the values are actually 40 and 8 and 23 and 10. So all these four are different values. And then these mathematical operators here join them together to form just one value. And that value is then 61. Okay? And so a value is basically the smallest unit of information that we have in JavaScript. Now, one extremely useful thing that we can do with values is to store them into variables. And so this way, we can reuse them over and over again. For example, we can say let, and then the name of the variable, and then assign a value like Jonas to this variable. Okay, and so what we did here is called declaring a variable. Okay, and so this will actually create a real variable in your computer's memory and will store this value inside of that variable. And actually, that is exactly what we did up here right in the beginning. So here we declared a variable called JS and assigned the value of amazing to that variable, right? And so now it hopefully makes sense to you what we did back then. So I like to imagine a variable like being a box. So in the real world, a box can hold some object, for example, a book, and we can then write a label on the box to describe what's in it. And then we can find the object later when we need it by using that label. And variables actually work in the exact same way. So here, basically, we have a box called first name. And into that box, we put the value of Jonas. And now, if we want to use this value, all we have to do is to basically use this label. Or in other words, this variable name. So first name in this case. And so let's use it actually. And for that, once again, I will use console.log. And you will see me using console.log throughout this entire course, actually. So whenever we need to output something from our code to the browser, we always use console.log like this. And so here, now, instead of passing a literal value like we did here and here and here, now we can pass in, so we can write here the variable name. So first name, okay? And if I save it and reload it, let's see what happens. Indeed, we get Jonas. So from line number 8, and so that's right here. And that means that indeed our variable declaration up here worked. And if we now change this to Bob, let's say, then here we should get Bob, right? And indeed, now it's Bob. Let's put it back. And of course, we can now use this variable name many times. So let's just copy and paste this here a couple of times. and give it a save. And so now we have it 3 times. And that means that whenever JavaScript sees this variable name here, it will basically replace it with the original value that we assigned to the variable. So again, that's Jonas. And this is extremely useful because now if I want to change the first name to something else, I only have to do it in one place. So just here. So let's change it here to Matilda. And if I save it now and reload, of course, it will change in all the 3 places. So this is one of the big advantages of variables. Without variables, I would now have to manually change the value everywhere to Matilda. But like this, everywhere where I reference this variable, it will automatically get changed to Matilda. So that's one of the most important things to keep in mind about variables. Great. And now that we know what a variable is, let's just very quickly talk about conventions and rules for naming variables. Because we shouldn't just give random names to variables. So first, the way that I named this variable here is called camel case. Camel case means that whenever I have multiple words in a variable name, I write the first word with a lowercase and then all the next words with uppercase, like this. So if it was just first, we would write it like this. But if we had more than one word, like first name, person, then you see that all the subsequent words are written with this uppercase letter. And this is kind of a standard in the JavaScript world. But of course, there are other ways of naming variables. For example, we could write first name with an underscore like this. And this is very popular in other languages like Ruby. Or like this, okay? And you can use whatever you like most. Just keep in mind that it's kind of a standard in JavaScript to write variable names like this. So usually whenever you see other people's code, the variables will usually be written using the camel case notation. So that's kind of a convention of how to name variables in JavaScript, but there are also some actual hard rules in JavaScript about how we can name variables. For example, we cannot write something like this, like 3 years, and set it to the value of 3. So this is an illegal variable name, and VS Code actually warns us right away here. And again, that's because this variable name starts with a number. And if we tried to load this in JavaScript, we would get this error. So that's an invalid or unexpected token here. And it's important to actually start reading these error messages right from the beginning of the course. So we see that this is a so-called syntax error, which means that we did a mistake in writing our code. So that's a mistake in the code's syntax. And we can also see the line where the error occurred, so line 13, so that we can then go ahead and fix it. And notice how this error was shown in the console, even though we didn't use console.log in this case. Okay, so we don't need to use console.log for the console to show errors. All the errors that we make will always end up in the console, and also here with this, error icon. Now anyway, back to our naming conventions here. So we already learned that variable names cannot start with a number. And in fact, variable names can only contain numbers, letters, underscores, or the $sign. So for example, if we try to write Jonas and Matilda equals JM, we would once again get a syntax error, right? And this time it's telling us unexpected token end. And again, that's because this symbol here is illegal in variable names. They can only contain numbers, letters, underscores, or the $sign. So this here, for example, would be allowed. So if we reload now, we get no more errors here. Another error might occur when we try to name a variable using a reserved JavaScript keyword. For example, if we did this, so new, for example, set it to 27, then this would also not be allowed. So you see unexpected token new. And that's because new is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, as we will see a little bit later. And the same goes for something like function. So again, unexpected token here. If we wanted to fix that, we could, for example, start this variable name with an underscore or with the $sign. So that's the only two symbols that are allowed besides letters and numbers. Another variable name that's kind of reserved but still actually allowed to use is the word name. So we could do this and it would actually work, but in some cases this creates some problems because again, this is kind of a reserved keyword, but it's still legal to use. But since it is a keyword, never call your variables just name. Okay, that's why I always call them first name like this. Let's actually get rid of this one because we already have first name up there. Now, another convention is that we should not start a variable name with an uppercase letter. So we should not do this. So let person Jonas. Now, again, it's a convention, so that's not illegal. It's just that we use this kind of variable names with an uppercase letter for a specific use case in JavaScript, which is object-oriented programming, as we will see later in the course. So for now, never do this, but instead you should write it like this, with a lowercase letter starting. On the same note, variables that are all in uppercase are reserved for constants that we know will never change. For example, the number pi, which is like 3.1415 and so on and so forth. So we know that this number is never going to change, and so that's a constant, and for that we have a convention of writing it in all uppercase. And VS Code actually marks this variable name with a different color because it knows about this convention that we use. Of course, you could also write it like this, but then this would be kind of weird actually. So if it's a real constant, write it in uppercase like this. So that's a pretty normal convention there in programming as a whole. Finally, to finish this lecture, let's talk about one final convention, which is to make sure that our variable names are descriptive. And that's very important to write cleaner code. So when you name your variables, it should be really easy to understand exactly what value the variable is holding, just by reading the name of the variable. And that's kind of what we did up here by calling this one first name. But let me show you another example. For example, let's say my first job, programmer, and then my current job, teacher. So this is much better than writing this. So job 1, programmer, and job 2, teacher. So which set of variables do you think is more descriptive? Is it these ones or these ones? And I hope that you agree with me that it's much easier to understand what programmer and teacher are in this case here by simply looking at the variable name. So we know that my first job was programmer and that my current job is teacher. While down here, well, we would simply know that these are two different jobs. We don't know anything about them. And so this approach up here is a lot better. So keep that in mind whenever you write your own variable names. And actually keep all of this in mind that we just talked about for naming your variables. Okay? So just to quickly recap what a variable actually is, it is basically a box into which we can store a value. So we give that box a name, which in this case here is first name, or in this case here, it's my first job, for example. And then into that box with that label, we can store a value, which in this case is this programmer string here. Then later in the code, we can reference that variable over and over again. For example, like this. My first job. And if I save this, then of course, here we see programmer. Once again, you probably saw my code changing here automatically from the single quotes to double quotes, but that is just my automatic formatting doing its work. And now if we wanted to change this here, let's say coder, then it would change across the entire program, and now we get coder here. And that's what variables are all about. They're one of the most important things of programming, and so make sure to really understand them before you move on.